So welcome back to Africa's a Country Talk, or in short, AIAC Live. I keep saying AIAC Live, AIAC Talk. This is episode 24. Can I redo that? This is episode 24. It's our third show of the new year. If you've forgotten who we are, I'm Sean Jacobs. I'm streaming from Brooklyn in New York City, where it had a snowstorm yesterday. Which is not what I imagined when I was a child, that I would end up in a place like that. With me is Shoki. He's in Johannesburg, South Africa. We are the co-presenters of this Africa as a Country's weekly discussion and interview show. Our producer is Antoinette Engel. She's in Cape Town, South Africa.
Just before the show, Antoinette was boasting about how beautiful the weather is in Cape Town. In Johannesburg, it's been raining every single day, so it's miserable here too. And just a reminder, as always, that if you missed our program last week, it was devoted to the life, thoughts, and legacy of the Pan-Africanist and revolutionary Amilcar Cabral. And he was assassinated in Conakry, Guinea on the 20th of January 1973. So that show was dedicated to him. And we were joined by Antonio Tomas, who's a scholar of Cabral, and he wrote a new biography about him. And we spoke about his book and his social political thoughts. And also Ricky Shriok, who's a journalist based in Senegal. And if you missed that, please watch clips from that show on our YouTube channel. Check out the full episode on our Patreon and the rest of our archive. So today, though, we have a fantastic program for you. What we want to talk about is how Israel is courting the African continent and its heightened bid for international legitimacy. I don't know if you guys have been paying attention to the news, but a few days ago, the nominees for the Nobel Peace Prize were announced. And Jared Kushner, if you remember that name from somewhere, he's been nominated for the Peace Prize, given his role in helping negotiate Israel's normalization relations with a lot of Arab countries. So another place where Israel is looking to build ties with and normalize its relations with is Africa. And we want to talk to Yotam, who recently completed his PhD at University, to ask him about Israel's strategy in Africa. And we're also going to have Matshidiso Motsoeneng, who's a researcher and activist at the Afro-Middle East Center in Johannesburg. And we want to understand from her what is to be done. If Israel is advancing on the continent, what can we do to resist that campaign?
So I just muted myself for a second there because it's like a massive snowblower going past my window. But first, we always start the show by talking a bit about, what people are talking about, like what are the big stories on social media. Usually we pick the thing that is important to us. But Will, you found something on the internet that you thought we should let people know about.
Yeah, well, if you're paying attention, this is a big news story, right? And it's fascinating, I think, the transformation of how we consume news lately, where it instantly becomes sort of memified. And a few days ago in Myanmar, a country in Southeast Asia, it experienced a coup. And I think it's a turning point in Myanmar's recent history, because since 2008, when Myanmar constructed a new constitution, it was supposed to undergo this democratization process. The short history of Myanmar as a country is that ever since it became independent of British rule in 1947, it has been under the leadership of successive military dictatorships. In 1990, people thought that was going to change after the results of popular protests for democracy. Myanmar had multi-party elections for the first time, and a party that was led by the now famous human rights advocate Aung San Suu Kyi, the National League for Democracy. It won that election, but then she was detained and the military dictatorship came back into power. She won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1991. And then fast forward to the new era in the 2000s, this democratization process began again. And in 2011, it sort of picked up pace. In 2015, there were elections for the first time and she came into power, became de facto leader. And last year, Myanmar had elections again, and the National League for Democracy won by a landslide. I think it's something like 83% of the vote. And basically what the Burmese military is alleging, like someone in another part of the world, is that that election was fraudulent. And on the basis of that accusation, they seized power again. And they had the room to seize power again because the constitution, which was crafted in 2008, gave a lot of power to the military. It gave them a quarter of the seats in parliament. It gave them the right to step in if they felt that democracy was under threat. And Aung San Suu Kyi has been detained. So there's this video that came out yesterday of an aerobics instructor who, I think part of her brand is that she goes in front of popular locations in Yangon, in Myanmar, and sort of conducts her aerobics lessons. And as she's conducting this aerobics lesson, the coup happens behind her. You see the military convoys pulling up into the streets and making their way to parliament. And if Antoinette can play the video, I think it's already there. I think it's just, I don't know, I think it's the most remarkable thing that I've seen in a long time. For some reason, I can't stop watching it. And what I think is so interesting about it is that I think it's part of this sort of new genre of media that we're seeing emerge as of late. You know, people have smartphones, they record anything everywhere, you're being watched all the time. Everybody knows this. But these sort of world historical moments being captured, these sort of concentrated periods of chaos, and then it's people just going about their lives normally, this sort of normalization of chaos. And I've been thinking about Jean Baudrillard, who's this, you know, political theorist who wrote in the early 2000s, in the late 1990s, and spoke about hyperreality, which is this increased inability that we're going to have to distinguish sort of reality from simulation, and sort of reality starting to have the characteristics of dystopia, but a kind of banal dystopia. And yeah, to me, this is just the most fascinating thing that I've seen in a long time. And it's now becoming the story of the coup. It's not the coup, it's this video of a person who is dancing in the middle of a coup.
Well, because I think there's been a couple of coups there before, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
So people are kind of used to the idea that there's not that it's we should think it's okay, but it's sort of predictable that the military behaves there like that. And now I think this kind of thing where it shows you the absurdity of the moment, like she's filming something mundane and we see this. I saw somebody on Twitter, I don't know if it could be verified, said that the lyrics that they're singing, I think, is also sort of ironically critiquing somebody who wants to take over something. And then you mocking that person. So there was a story on Al Jazeera where she was asked, was your intent to mock the government or mock somebody? And she's like, no, I'm just making a performance. But the other thing, quickly, before we bring on our first guest, Will, which I know you want to say something about, because I think, and maybe I'll add something at the end of it, has been the events in India with the massive strike of the last couple of weeks. Or is it, I think it's been a month or so, right?
Maybe, yeah, it's been since like November, actually. And
yeah, by Indian farmers. And it's the thing that's been interesting is there's these really beautiful videos of them coming into Delhi, being welcomed by people, spraying confetti on them. And it's an interesting moment around sort of political struggle, like contemporary political struggle. We very rarely see these days a struggle by farmers. I mean, if it's a struggle by farmers, then it's a kind of reactionary struggle usually. I think the last time we may have seen something was during the beginnings of the anti-globalization movement, or at the height of it. In France, I think there were farmers involved in the anti-mondialisme. But you haven't seen that kind of thing, I think, in Africa in a while. You've seen it maybe with the social revolutions of the 1970s, maybe kind of early 1980s, Thomas Sankara, maybe Jerry Rawlings's government, Jerry Rawlings's revolution, you may have seen something like it. But more recently, most struggles, if we think of urban struggle. So this is an interesting moment. And there was one other thing we want to put on screen. It got to the point where Rihanna, who is for some people, I suppose, she's, who's a muse to some people, she tweeted out, why aren't we talking about this? Why aren't we talking about this major moment, this struggle? And I'm just curious, Will, what your sort of feelings is about this kind of rural-based struggle that pushed themselves to the front page.
I mean, I think you've said everything, and just to add to it, I think it's interesting to see that the peasant class is not obsolete. So we are under this impression that these new waves of struggles and mobilizations that we've seen happen all across the world since Occupy are primarily going to be led by people living in the urban areas and metropoles. And that sort of thinking sort of excludes a large portion of the global population, especially in the global south, the majority of whom are still based in rural areas. And as you say, it's sort of like a lot of people have given up on the prospects of politicizing people who hail from rural areas. And so to see how this collective action is being undertaken in an extremely effective way, in an extremely unified way, and they're not backing down. These agricultural laws, they're saying to the government, we want them completely repealed. We don't want negotiation for another year. We don't want special task teams to be forced. We want our demands to be met. I think just is really inspiring when it comes to thinking about the possibilities for collective action, when I think for the longest time, we felt as if the possibilities for collective action in this moment were extremely limited. And I think it just goes to show that we're not looking far enough in terms of whom the groups of people our politics can encompass. And we shouldn't dismiss those people who are in rural areas working as farmers, fighting mining corporations, so on and so forth. And yeah, I think that's an important thing to take away from this. You know, it's the biggest, I've seen that it's the biggest mobilization in possibly world history. So that's monumental.
Right. We want to see more rural struggle and get them on the program. In any case, Tony Karan actually points out in the comments, he points out an interesting point about Aung San Suu Kyi, like how she's very much viewed as a human rights icon of sorts, but she herself is problematic within the politics of Myanmar.
What's suppressing the Muslim Rohingya?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, you know, problematic there. But in any case, a reminder to hit like and subscribe on our YouTube, as well as follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And please subscribe to our Patreon, where you can access all of the show's clips, and as well as the full episode, and help fund Africa the Country in general. Will's pointing to the link. Now on to our first guest. I know that's why people are here, rather than hearing us babbling on about historical struggles. Our first guest is Yotam Gidron. Yotam is a researcher whose work focuses on authority, faith, migration, and conflicts. He has worked with civil society organizations in Israel and East Africa, and recently completed his PhD in African history at Durham University in the UK. And finally, he's published a new book, which is kind of also why he's here, on Israel's Africa strategy, called Israel in Africa: Security, Migration, and Interstate Politics, which was published by Z Books last year. So Yotam, welcome to the show. You're from Israel, and in your book, you begin by talking about how Africa isn't studied with interest in Israel, and how Israel largely sees itself as part of the Western world. So its interactions elsewhere are not acknowledged in ordinary consciousness. So how did you become interested in Israel's dealings in Africa? To the extent that you decided to write a book about
it? Well, I think my story is partly entangled in the broader politics that the book tells. I started working with refugees in Israel around 10 years ago. Perhaps a bit more. Refugees coming from the Horn of Africa, so South Sudanese, Eritreans, and Sudanese. And I was a law student at the time, and I worked with a few civil society organizations on refugee rights issues. And if you remember, or if you got to that point in the book, in 2012, Israel deported the South Sudanese community from Israel, so right after the independence of South Sudan. And then quite quickly, I abandoned my legal future, or the future I didn't have as a lawyer, and shifted to African history and African politics. And from that, so I started with a more migration part of the story, but then gradually began to look at the broader picture. And the book came out, as we just discussed very briefly before, just out of, well, it came from the International African Institute here in London as an idea in African arguments. But the reason I wanted to write it is partly because there was no such book, and it felt such a weird gap that no one is addressing, and in a sense felt important. Now people kind of forgot about many of these things with COVID, but
I mean, you're exactly right. And I mean, some of the conversation we were having just before the show was more about the lack of academic interest and the lack of scholarly effort invested into writing about this book. But I guess for the ordinary person, maybe to ask a more basic question, which is, what exactly are Israel's interests in the African continent? Because I think that the way we understand politics is that, Africa is not really people view Africa as not really being central to the foreign policy maneuvers of any country. It's often just a matter of concern as far as aid is concerned, or I don't know, whatever other
humanitarian missions.
Humanitarian missions, intervening in wars, terror, whatever, and so on. Why would Israel be interested in Africa? Why does it want to, and why has it wanted to project its influence on the continent?
Well, there are several answers, and it depends if we look at the recent period or the longer history of that. But I think overall some of the themes are very similar, and that is Israel's kind of, from the moment it began to exist as a state in 1948, this problematic position of, is it a legitimate entity, kind of a post-colonial state of a liberated people, or kind of a settler colonial state, an imperial outpost, whichever way you want to call it, apartheid today. So, and for Israel, Africa was always kind of a mirror that allowed it to try to reshape the narrative around what is going on in Israel-Palestine. So in the 50s, late 50s, early 60s, when many African countries gained independence, it was an attempt by Israel, there was an attempt, a very concentrated kind of effort to mobilize as many countries as possible in the continent to kind of fit Israel within the Afro-Asian world at the time. Largely because Israel needed not only the legitimacy in terms of the rhetoric, but also because it needed votes in the UN to counter pressure around the issue of Palestinian refugees and the pressure from Arab countries. And then some of these issues, we see them kind of coming back throughout history. So one of the things that pushed Israel back to Africa around a decade ago was, again, Palestinian attempts to mobilize the international community to recognize Palestinian statehood, which kind of, I think, reminded Israelis that they need this support, this diplomatic support from Africa. It's not the only issue that made Israel kind of return to Africa recently, but it's one of them. Obviously, on a more strategic level, Israel borders Africa. Many of Israel's conflicts, Israel is no longer in conflict with Egypt, but it was for many years, and for many years it was its kind of main rival, the main military power in the region threatening it. So it was always important for Israel to forge some military alliance within the immediate kind of neighborhood, and that includes the Horn of Africa, to kind of manage the security situation in the Middle East. In that sense, the Horn of Africa and Northeast Africa is immediately linked to whatever goes on in the Middle East.
So in the beginning of the book, and I think this would be, for some readers, this might come as a surprise, you tell the story of how Israel, particularly in the 1960s, it starts to take Africa seriously. And if you could just say a little bit about kind of like just some of the highlights of that relationship. So I think in the book you describe it as Israel's African adventure. And as part of that, I think there's also some surprises in that story, which is some African leaders that we have sort of popular accounts about them as sort of anti-imperialists, anti-Zionists. But in the book, it actually turns out that they have their own peculiar history with Israel. And after you sort of just get the general story, if you could just say something about just one or two of these, and I think in particular the ones I was not surprised by, but because also they take the sort of third world underlying approach of Nkrumah and even Neherere. So could you just say the general kind of Israeli approach you sort of mentioned already, it's like it sees itself as in the same position as these newly independent African Asian states. But just kind of like, what was Israel trying to do? And then secondly, just say a little bit, as I said, about these kind of, if you could sort of talk about two of these, Nyerere and Nkrumah.
Well, yeah. So on a practical level, partly the tension was, between Israel and Egypt at the time, who is going to kind of shape how will Pan-Africanism will look in these years, because this is exactly the years of African independence. And the Organization of African Unity was not yet established. And part of the question was, are we going to kind of mobilize African countries to support Israel in this struggle, or are they going to sign up to the Arab side? And there was this kind of race between Israel and Egypt to mobilize whichever countries they could. And Nkrumah was one of the main figures to support Israel at the time, to support Israel's efforts in Africa. So Ghana was kind of Israel's main gate to Africa, even though it had relations with other countries. And what Israel mainly did in this very short period of the late 50s and early 60s is invest quite a lot in state-led initiatives and development. So technical support, some arms sales, but not as significant as they became later. Cooperations between Israeli government companies and African governments in all sorts of development projects. And it was a kind of a concentrated effort that Israel didn't have the resources to maintain for a long time. But it was very important to work through these very significant figures like Nkrumah and Nyerere at the time to mobilize this support for Israel. Tanzania was also important, and that also links a bit to what we mentioned briefly earlier, because Israel had this double position where it wanted to maintain good ties with Western countries and with South Africa, but at the same time it wanted to show African countries that actually it has a place in this sort of Afro-Asian solidarity movement. And that meant that Israel tried throughout this period to support different liberation movements. And it's almost a kind of an ironic situation where Israel had ties with South Africa, but it also supported some African liberation movements through their offices in what was Tanganyika or Tanzania later. ZANU, Frelimo, and some South African movements. I mean, some Israeli diplomats still mention often that Israel trained at some point in Ethiopia in the 60s. So it was really important for Israel to try to kind of dance in these two weddings at the time.
And just as a sort of follow-up to this, there's kind of Israel and these newly independent, if you want, Black African countries. And then throughout this, and you've already sort of mentioned them, there's South Africa. Can you just say something about that long relationship? I think earlier we sort of noted before the program that I think you corrected me. I think it's 1953. D.F. Malan visits Israel, the newly independent state of Israel. Then, as you said, Israel is kind of aware in its struggle with Egypt. It's playing a rhetorical game regarding independence, some support. How does South Africa fit into this? Because later on, we also know, John Foster goes there to visit Israel. He becomes the prime minister of South Africa in the late 1960s, and later on the state president in the 70s. And South Africa, Israel and South Africa make alliances around nuclear weapons. Can you just kind of sketch this kind of relationship with South Africa, if it's as straightforward as people think it is?
Well, I meant
apartheid South Africa when I said South Africa.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, I think there was this short period where Israel tried to position itself as one of these Afro-Asian countries and try to express, even in the UN, kind of with rhetorical statements, express kind of its opposition to apartheid. But then it was already in the mid-60s that kind of the money for this enterprise ran out, and it was clear that Israel is losing this game, I think, with the Arab world, with the influence of Egypt and Nasser. And there was a short period when I think it was clear that Israel is not going to win this game, and then came the 67 war, and the whole thing kind of fell apart because Israel could no longer claim that it's not an occupying force, that it's not a colonial state. I mean, the kind of whatever war of propaganda was clearly lost at that point. And Israel maintained its ties with most African countries until the 73 war, but relations were already kind of falling apart, and there wasn't much. It was clear that Israel, I think it's increasingly clear that Israel is not going to be able to salvage that. And this is when gradually the alliance with South Africa kind of emerged. It just, I think, became clear that this alliance worth much more to Israel strategically, militarily, than all the small African countries that may or may not support Israel in the UN. It became increasingly clear that they will not support Israel. And then in the 73 war, most countries cut their ties with Israel, and then Israel became kind of an open ally of apartheid South Africa. Openly an ally of apartheid South Africa, and secretly quite a significant military ally.
So you mentioned the 73 war, the 67 war happened before that, and then the 70s was this period of instability globally, not just geopolitically in terms of all the conflict that was happening, but also the radical social and economic changes taking place as well. So the rise of neoliberalism, and then as we enter the new decade, as we enter the 90s rather, to give the abridged history, the Berlin Wall falls. It's the end of history, and this new period of peace, and so on and so forth. So to jump forward to the present, I mean, you talk about in the book how something changes, where previously Israel's activities were largely conducted at the level of the state, and it was engaging with other states, and it was largely articulated as these modernization projects to build states. And then from the 1990s into the 2000s, we see more private actors like security agencies and companies playing a dominant role in how Israel's diplomacy plays out. So, and you describe it as it resulting in a kind of clandestine diplomacy. So could you unpack that for us? Because, I mean, as you point out, it's difficult in this new sort of way of doing things to point out where the state's interests end and where private interests begin. So how did we see the sort of privatization of Israeli foreign policy? How did that kind of play out?
Yeah, I think there's a dynamic here between securitization and privatization, and historically they kind of bleed into each other, because it's already in the 60s. You would see that increasingly security actors have more and more power in determining how Israel's relationship with countries in Africa evolve. You see kind of increasingly the Mossad doing things behind the back of other actors, this defense ministry doing things, selling arms, initiating cooperations between the back of other actors. And I mean, I think the clear example is Israel's support to South Sudanese rebels in the 60s. It's a clear example because in the early 60s, the rebels came and said they want support, and Israel said, no, that's not something we are interested in. But by the late 60s, where it became more important for Israel, the Mossad took over and just provided this support. But then after most countries cut ties with Israel, obviously there is no, the diplomatic relations kind of either disappear or operate in a very quiet manner. But many of the private actors that were already operating in Africa can stay and continue to do business in the continent. And many of the different security corporations, wherever they exist, and they're not necessarily that strong in many countries, can continue as well. So places like Kenya, Ethiopia, security actors could have quite close relationships with governments that openly resisted or said they have no relations with Israel. So there's this kind of intelligence security relationships that exist beneath the surface. But what you also have is increasingly actors that were part of some kind of an Israeli formal presence in Africa, either diplomatic or security, that once they finish their job, stay around to be kind of private contractors, advisors of all sorts, intermediaries. And you see that in many countries, increasingly throughout the 80s and 90s. And whenever Israel kind of tries to rebuild its relationship with African countries, these are the networks that are already there for it to do that. Rather than build, again, kind of an institutionalized state-to-state relationship, you build on these kind of privatized, various different networks that look quite differently in different countries, but what they have in common is that they are extremely informal, often have to do with different industries, security industries, mining, things like that. And that is something that we see shaping Israel's presence in Africa until today.
But at the same time, and I have one more question before we bring the other guests on. At the same time, with Netanyahu, there's also been like an increase in these kind of state to state, right? He's gone on these diplomatic trips, and I think in the book you read about, you opened the book with the inauguration of Uhuru Kenyatta after the disputed election, and he goes on to Guinea, Senegal, etc. But the question before we go to the next session, and hopefully you'll stick around, is this question about it's not a one-way kind of story. At some level, there's also Africans who get something out of their relationship with Israel. Like, they're also active agents in this relationship, right? And I think you mentioned in the book, I think at least a different sets of actors, like evangelical movements, Pentecostalist movements. And then they have their own ideology of how they think the world works and how the world will end, how conflict will be resolved. And at the same time, the Israeli government gets something out of them. You mentioned in the book also like different African leaders who use Israel for their own geostrategic interests, where they are, their own needs, whether it will be around military, whether it's technology, industrial, agricultural, etc. And then finally, I think there's the question of Israel. Israel has a migrant crisis, and you have African countries are now solving that, helping Israel solve what Israel might refer to as the infiltrators, the state sort of official rhetoric. Can you just say a little bit about those people, like these? And I know it's a big answer with stress for time.
You mentioned quite a lot of things.
We cannot pretend like this is a one-way relationship. There are Africans here with their own interests, and they went into a relationship with Israel too.
Yeah. First, but though you mentioned the kind of more state-to-state dynamics of the last couple of years, and I think one important thing that we need to take into account is that, yes, Netanyahu is very good in doing PR and doing hasbara and, providing a narrative or kind of consolidating a story about what is going on. Once we look behind the kind of, the rhetoric, I don't think we find a lot of state-to-state interactions and cooperation in the last couple of years. If you look at how much money was Israel willing to put in its so-called return to Africa, you hardly find anything. So it's an attempt to push private actors, business people, businesses, different kind of corporations that are mostly economic, including security sales, into Africa. But you don't really find in Israel's engagement the sort of institutionalized, aid, development, all of these things that you would see in, European countries, or even not state-to-state kind of military cooperation. That's also very limited. So yeah, but then on the other side of these relationships, yes, I mean, there are different kind of vectors that shaped why African countries look at Israel as a potential useful ally. And you mentioned Pentecostalism, which I think is extremely influential at this current phase of Israel-Africa relations because of the increasing influence of Pentecostal movements on politics in so many countries. When we talk about Israel's kind of return to Africa in the last decade, so of course there are the Israeli interests of the Palestinians and Iran and migration issues, but there's also the clear shift and the clear movement of, I think, the kind of Pentecostalization of politics in many countries. And the important thing here is that Pentecostal movements are usually very open to endorsing Zionist theologies, not necessarily because of an end of time scenarios and dispensationalist worldviews, but also because of the emphasis on kind of divine blessing, and whoever blesses, the idea that whoever blesses Israel and does things for Israel will be blessed, which I think resonates quite strongly with Pentecostal ways of understanding the Bible. And then lastly, migration was, I think, one of the things that kind of pushed Israel back to Africa over the last decade. In addition to, the geopolitics and the Palestinian issue, the arrival of African refugees to Israel in the late 2000s, and then increasingly Israel looks for partners in Africa that will be willing to take these people back. So Israel, from the late 2000s, started reaching out to different countries in Africa, often via different intermediaries, diplomats, whoever is there, business people, offering all sorts of deals and bargains for sending these people back. And we saw these things materialize eventually, with Uganda and Rwanda agreeing to take people. Well, South Sudan agreed to take its own citizens immediately after independence. And it also, had kind of bought considerable security, different arms from Israel. But then Rwanda and Uganda, two other countries that developed quite a close relationship with Israel, agreed to take refugees as well from 2013.
So we're now going to, thanks for that, Yotam. We're now going to bring in our
we
next.
can go forever, but we have to.
Probably, yeah.
Yeah, we need to bring in Matshidiso Motsoeneng to join the conversation. Matshidiso is a researcher at the Afro-Middle East Center in Johannesburg, and before this, she worked as a researcher and analyst at the Studies in Poverty and Inequality Institute. She's currently completing a Master's of Arts in Politics and IR at the University of Johannesburg, and her interests include gender, geopolitics, foreign policy, and security studies. So, Matshidiso, thank you so much for joining us today. I want to start with this sort of elements to the conversation we're having about the rise of Pentecostalism, and Yotam just touched on it now. And here in South Africa, we're seeing that because a scandal that happened very recently was South Africa's Chief Justice, Mogoeng, appearing on a webinar organized by the Jerusalem Post, where he made remarks to the effect of suggesting that an anti-Israeli posture would bring great curses to the nation, and it's improper and incorrect and unchristian to criticize Israel is effectively the extent of what he was suggesting. And I mean, when this happened, I mean, I was taken aback. I think a lot of people were taken aback, but this is proving to be a very sort of pernicious influence that is really starting to come onto the scene. And what do you think is sort of leading to the rise of Christian Zionism playing a dominant role in shaping people's attitudes about Israel and Palestine?
I think globally, as Yotam said in the previous conversation, the dominant, increase of Pentecostal movements, Christian evangelical churches having a great influence in politics globally. We've seen with, for example, the election campaign of Donald Trump that has resonated quite, beyond even just US borders on this issue of supporting Israel and bringing that into the political sphere. In the South African case, I mean, the comments by the Chief Justice of, the highest court in the land, a constitutional democracy, effectively telling people not to criticize Israel because, the wrath of God will fall on you, was laughable, but very painful at the same time, because you have this, what we saw as a very, a great man, a person who represents values for democracy, human rights, etc., sitting at the highest court in the land. And I mean, we know South Africa's constitution for its own, championing of human rights, etc. And for him to come out and say this, especially in light of the fact that we have a lot of activists, in South Africa supporting Palestinians, playing a big role in Palestinian solidarity, that have been literally crucified by the Israeli lobby in this country, to the effect of even being taken to court for things like hate speech, being anti-Semitic, etc. The case in point that's very important is the Bongani Masuku case, and having a court judge come out so vehemently supporting Israel and, linking this to this religious narrative in this country just kind of mirrored the point at which we find ourselves in this country. I know as an activist in South Africa, supporting and advocating for Palestinian struggle, we find these kinds of narratives. There's a huge pushback, and I think the Israeli lobby has found a way to permeate in these spaces and push the narrative of, supporting Israel is basically going according to the word of God. I had to have a long conversation with my, people from my own family, friends of mine who were very like, no, but what you mean we can't, what do you mean Israel is an apartheid state? What do you mean we should be protesting against Israel? These are God's chosen people, kind of thing. So this narrative is really growing, and because the Palestinian solidarity in the continent has been very I think increasingly weakening because again of the very increasingly great support that African states and African leaders are showing towards Israel. It hasn't been pushed back as much as it should be, and there isn't even what I can call a vocabulary for many activists in the country, in the continent, even in the country, to be able to educate and form a narrative that is perhaps I could say familiar to the Pentecostal movements, to these Christian evangelical movements, to engage about the political issue that comes with, supporting the state of Israel.
But doesn't this all probably also reflects, I suppose, changes within these African states themselves, which is that the social and political elites at the top, who were often associated with liberation movements or nationalist struggles, they were on the side of Palestinians. Those projects, the political project of that movement usually ran into the ground or into crisis, neoliberalism, structural adjustment, etc. And so it's very hard and also in the process, regular people, their understanding of how the world works and what is going wrong for them, they started, what explains the world is they're not doing right by God or something, and if that falls within their theology, that Israel is part of that setup, it's very hard, I suppose, to break that. So my question really on that is, does you mentioned there that activists don't have a vocabulary, and maybe this is my question, does BDS, for example, this is the predominant movement, right, who's in a sort of war of, I suppose, a propaganda war or diplomatic war even with Israel, do they have a strategy to talk to evangelicals about this, or have they just sort of given up? Again, from your experience in South Africa.
Okay, thank you. I think just to go back a little on the issue of liberation movement and the resonation with the Palestinian struggle in the country. What we've seen is that African youth in the face of rising economic hardships, political instability, youth unemployment, etc. What we've seen with the Arab uprisings, the civil wars in countries such as West Africa, Central Africa, etc. There is this huge shift of youth not identifying with their own national liberation struggles in their own countries. So that also translates into connecting with other struggles for national liberation, the Palestinian struggle in case in point. The old liberation movements, the likes of ZANU, the likes of the PAC and the ANC in South Africa, still very much, hold the issue of the Palestinian struggle. It's very much engraved in their political policies, their political strategies, but this still does not reach the youth, which, of course, the entire continent is largely a youth population, which should, ideally be playing a big role in pushing for the Palestinian issues to continue being part of our discourse. But this is not happening, as I said, because of the political instability, the economic issues that many young people in this continent face. what we're seeing with BDS is, of course, great successes that BDS has had in the continent. South Africa is a huge case in point to how the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement has had a great influence in lobbying government in being able to have and continue a diplomatic support for Palestine continuously and sustained in terms of government policies. And that has largely been because of the ANC being a national liberation movement, still being in power, and as I said, having the roots with the PLO part in the past in the 1960s, etc. Those links still continue to facilitate some of the successes and great achievements that the BDS movement has had in the country, in the continent, to a certain extent. What has been, unfortunately, a big, I think, obstacle in this is that with growing authoritarianism in the country, different governments in this continent becoming increasingly autocratic, the civil society space is also becoming very narrow. It's also becoming very stifled. Not a lot of space available for civil society actors, activists to come out and lobby government and push for government to be more robust and radical on its position to support Palestinians, and to issues such as the labeling of Israeli products from occupied territories, etc., which could see great successes if the civil society space was available for activists to be able to do this. So
the thing, sorry. The thing about labeling products is, I think that's a sort of very middle class politics, where this is my comment about like how do you talk to China. But I think in Yotam's book he writes about kind of the influence of somebody like Kenneth Mweswe, who was the head of the African Christian Democratic Party. I want Yotam, if you could say a little bit more about kind of how Israel operates in a country like South Africa, because as we mentioned, as we sort of get the impression, South Africa is a bit of an outlier in this story. As a state, it has a different relationship to Israel. I think it has a diplomatic representative in Palestine, if I'm not mistaken, and in Israel. Or maybe you can explain that situation to me. And then I think, but more than that, I think just kind of like the work of if you want, Hasbara in South Africa is actually quite organized, right? Scholarships, trips. I think in the book you mentioned Mweswe's daughter goes to Israel regularly. I understand that members of the ANC Youth League have gone to Israel on trips. Popular performers like Black Coffee, the South African performer, have performed in Israel. Can you just unpack this kind of like, and maybe as part of your answer, has it been that there was at some point at a mass level a sort of understanding of like, this is an occupation that's happening in Israel, or was this mostly like the politics of South African elites?
Not sure I got the last. Well,
the last one is really kind of like, so in South Africa, I think there's always a perception that the idea that South Africans or Black South Africans are on the side of the Palestinians, that is assumed. But as we're sort of learning now, it's a little bit more complicated, right? There's evangelical Christians. And my question is like, is that necessarily the case? Or was it that it was always perhaps much more a sort of activist core, a layer of people who are a sort of literary lead, people, people who are politically involved, people who are members of the ANC, as Matshidiso sort of explained. Is it more complicated like that?
Well, there are a few things here, and one of them is I think South Africa is very different from other countries in its relationship with Israel, both for historical reasons of apartheid, but also in terms of the Christian landscape in South Africa that is a bit different from some of the other countries. Because in many West African countries, but also in East Africa, you see that big Pentecostal actors that kind of emerged starting from the 80s and kind of had increasingly a greater influence on the political sphere from the 1990s and 2000s, are the big supporters of Israel, and their influence kind of extends far beyond Pentecostal churches to, the Anglican Church, the Catholic Church, whoever. So many people sign up to Zionist theologies, even if in theory their churches are not Pentecostal. Whereas in South Africa, the biggest, and I think, there are different born-again Pentecostal churches, evangelical churches supported by the US mainly, that are pro-Israel in South Africa, but there's also the Zion Christian Church that is not usually seen as part of the Pentecostal kind of landscape, or is not exactly, but is quite clearly pro-Israel in its attitude, and it's been kind of a gate for Israeli diplomacy in South Africa to influence the kind of, the way people understand Israel. And obviously these actors have a huge influence on the, how people, everyday people, think about Israel, not only in South Africa, but across Africa. So that's one thing that makes South Africa a bit different. I think also in terms of the BDS and the resistance, probably South Africa is the only country, and I'm not talking here about, North African Arab countries, where this resistance has a clear impact on kind of the way politics work. You don't see that, obviously. I mean, okay, sometimes you see that in Nigeria, a bit in Ghana, but when, if Israeli diplomats speak about people's general attitude towards Israel, then it's extremely positive across Africa. And it's rare that there will be kind of a controversy, as it was in South Africa around, was it black coffee performing in Israel, was quite a controversial issue. You wouldn't probably find this sort of controversy happening in other countries, in Kenya or Rwanda or Ethiopia. Nobody will say anything, probably. So in that sense, I think the attitude in South Africa is quite unique. But I almost forgot what the beginning of this question was.
I mean, I have a follow-up, and Matshidiso and Yotam, you can both answer here. I'm interested to know what is Israel's perception of South Africa at the moment. I think as this conversation evolves, we're getting this picture of South Africa as being a country of strategic interests, in large part because of South Africa's experience of apartheid. And the charge of Israel being an apartheid state is advanced predominantly because it's legitimated by South Africans who say, yes, it conforms to the experience that we had, and the definition that was generated by South Africans is one that South Africans speak authoritatively on, of Israel conforming to that definition. So I'm interested to know, what is Israel making of all of this? How does it understand its own attitude to South Africa, and how it should operate in relation to South Africa as far as its own interests are concerned?
William, I think, Israel is very much aware of, as I said, the strong links to the Palestinian struggle, to the South African experience. And they, a large part of it is perhaps accepted, but that doesn't mean that they stop, right? So economic diplomacy still continues. We know of the recent cases of the Israeli company buying our clover company here in South Africa, and the huge controversy that caused, but also because Israel has, over the past, since I think the post-democratic state, used South Africa as a sort of a landing base to the other African countries, especially under the after the Spear Initiative under the Thabo Mbeki administration, that obviously was a dismal fail, but the Israelis used that opportunity, especially to court other African countries, but also establish its economic links, etc., and its facilitate other ways of lobbying the ANC government and other people in government for its support. But under the Zuma administration, because of what became an increasingly silent approach of South Africa in terms of foreign policy in the continent. Israel has used South Africa to, its embassy, its actors in South Africa to go out in other countries, neighboring countries in SADC, countries in the continent who have seen South Africa's declining position in terms of influence in regional bodies such as the AU and SADC to try and again push for its interests, etc. But I mean, they still maintain an embassy in Pretoria, despite the fact that, South Africa downgraded its embassy in Tel Aviv and recalled its ambassador. But they very much know that the approach in South Africa, especially from a government point of view, it's always trying to see this sort of a balancing act of some sort, and they're really taking advantage of that. With the many countries in Africa sort of going on their own, the likes of what we've seen in Malawi with the election of President Chakwera, who's a Christian evangelist, the likes of under President Mnangagwa, who's also trying to get close to Israel, really going against what has been a long, standing position from SADC, etc. South Africa's lobbying efforts at the AU, for example, have not really materialized to the point that they want. There's strong voices coming out, the likes of Rwanda, the likes of Kenya, Uganda, etc., supporting Israel and really actively lobbying for Israel to kind of get the observer status at the AU that they've been really seeking for quite a long time. I think South Africa's silence in that space in foreign policy and trying to push for issues on the continental level has created this vacuum for Israel to really get in and push for other actors in the continent.
Sean, you're on mute.
Yotam, do you wanna add anything to that before I ask a question?
There were so many things to say.
There always is.
Yeah, I know, and I'm looking at the clock. But just one thing on the beginning of the answer on the kind of economic ties, because that applies to everywhere in Africa. And I think we spoke about the kind of, political issues that drive Israel to look for support in Africa, but we also shouldn't exaggerate what that actually means. Few African countries have enough weight in the international sphere to actually influence significantly the situation in the Middle East, for sure. And sometimes they do when, suddenly they have a seat in the Security Council or they have a significant influence in the African Union, then Israel needs them. But otherwise, the economic interests are always there. And which, South Africa is one of the largest economic partners Israel has in the continent, and it doesn't really matter what the government thinks about the occupation. And that's true for other countries, Angola, that may not have a very close relationship with Israel, but also has close economic ties. That links for another thing, but I don't remember what exactly it was. So go for it. Back to you.
I have a question which, as you know, in this program, we always get back to football. We always talk about football. I know both of you. I don't know about Yotam, whether he likes football.
Eyes wagging. She's like, oh no.
In South Africa, everybody loves football. But there is this question that increasingly the battles over, for example, the struggle for around sort of the Palestinian statehood or right political self-determination, etc., that these things are being fought now. It seems that when we mentioned BDS and in the comments people are talking about it, increasingly it's like social movements, trade unions, like the battle, those kind of battles. I mean, so my question is really like, in Africa, are the battles over Israel-Palestine, are they played also by social movements? Like what social movements are involved in those struggles? And related to that, this is why I said football, the sports boycott was really significant in the struggle in South Africa. Has the question of Israel's participation in international sporting events, is that coming up in these popular struggles, or what direction or tone do these struggles take? Either of you can answer.
I've been preoccupied with that point I missed last time. Can I get back to it? I think part of the reason these battles trickle down to civil society actors, and you see increasingly governments in Africa uninterested in the Palestinian issue. We can speak about the ideological kind of interest, but there's also, part of the success of the last decade of the Israeli government has been fracturing Palestinian leadership and support anyway, like within Israel, Palestine. And that links back to, the Abraham normalization agreements and all of that. In a sense, for governments around the world to stand behind the Palestinian issue became not a very viable position at the international level. And this is why I think you see increasingly less government interested in holding that position, because it's, no one stands behind it anymore, or increasingly fewer actors stand behind it. And that has also economic implications. And that might be one reason we see the battle over these things kind of leaking to civil society actors and to questions that are more in principle rather than, questions that have a pragmatic impact on the situation in Israel-Palestine. Kind of symbolic questions about recognition, about, how we label things, how we call Israel, whether it's apartheid or not.
Okay. I think just to come in there, as William said, when you spoke about soccer, my eyes just really came out. But in terms of things like, sports boycott, etc., in South Africa, the civil society space supporting Palestinian solidarity has been quite vocal about this. I know when an Israeli hockey team, I think, came to play in the country, there were, large protests and, really a big pushback against this. Again, it's because South Africa comes from a place where civil society is quite amenable for actors to come out and do these kinds of things, whereas in other parts of the continent, the shrinking space for civil society is stifling some of these efforts. But we've seen because of the country's long history with national liberation movements that were saw themselves to a large extent as socialist, etc. The formation of trade unions, socialist parties or parties that see themselves as socialist or left-leaning parties that are still very vocal on the issue of Palestine and really trying to bring that to the fore. But because, again, they're almost always in the minority, that has made, to the ability to branch out in things like the sports boycott, cultural boycotts, etc., has made it increasingly hard for activists to go into these spaces and also, try and form and shape and direct discourse around the issue of supporting Palestine and the Palestinian struggle in the continent.
And on that note, I mean, we could talk forever on this. I mean, this is just the largest topic, and I'm just sitting here thinking about all the things I wish I'd asked and should have asked, but I'm pretty sure that we're going to have you guys back soon.
And there's a ton of questions. There's a ton of questions. We want to apologize also to our audience on Facebook, Twitter. People just have questions that they want us to ask, but we're dealing here with time, and we can only ask so many things. Yeah.
Yeah, but thank you so much to both of you. Thank you so much, Matshidiso. Thank you so much, Yotam. If you can, be sure to purchase Yotam's book to continue the conversation with yourself. Send him an email if you have any questions that come up. Send Matshidiso an email, perhaps. We're so grateful to have had both of you on today's show. Thank you so much to our magnificent producer, Antoinette Engel, who's in Cape Town. This is the end of today's program. Catch us next week at the same time, 5 p.m. GMT, 7 p.m. Central African time, and 12 p.m. if you're in America or somewhere, like Shawnee. And thank you so much for tuning in. We'll see you next week. And remember that our struggle for liberation anywhere in the world isn't complete until the Palestinian liberation struggle happens. So on that note, see you all next week. Bye-bye.